Talk Python to Me, episode number 6, with guest Kenneth Reitz, recorded Friday, April 17th, 2015.
I'm a developer in many senses of the word, cause I make these applications, but I also use these verbs to make this music. I construct it line by line, just like when I'm coding another software design. In both cases, it's about design patterns. Anyone can get the job done, it's the execution that matters. I have many interests, sometimes it conflict.
Hello and welcome to Talk Python to Me, a weekly podcast on Python, the language, the libraries, the ecosystem, and the personalities. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Follow me on Twitter where I'm at mkennedy, and keep up with the show and listen to past episodes at talkpythontome.com. This episode will be talking to Kenneth Reitz about requests, the package, API design, PyCon, and more. Hello, Michael here. I've got a couple of news items for you. First, thank you to everyone who contacted or mentioned the show on Twitter, where we're at TalkPython. I really appreciate the feedback and suggestions, and it's also a nice way to let others know about the show, and it makes a big difference for us. Next, if you're listening to the show and you have not yet subscribed, please do. Open up your favorite podcatcher and search for Python. The show should be right near the top. If it isn't, send me a note and I'll try to fix that. How about a t-shirt? I think I have a really cool design for a Talk Python themed t-shirt. If there's enough interest, I'll actually create it. Visit talkpythontome.com, look in the footer, and click t-shirt, or just visit talkpythontome.com/home/shirt and press the button. Finally, I want to say thank you to Tobias, Macy, and Chris Patty. In some crazy coincidence, the Python community was without a proper podcast for almost a year. Then Tobias and Chris and I independently set about creating new podcasts. And with all the setup and scheduling and million little items that it takes to get a podcast off the ground, we ended up releasing in the very same week. Amazing. Check out their show called Podcast Under a Knit at podcastinit.com. Now, let's get on to speaking with the amazing Kenneth Reitz. Kenneth, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Yeah, this is great. You've built some amazing open source packages, and I'm glad we got a chance to share that with the world.
Absolutely. I'm really glad to be here.
Cool. So before we get into sort of modern day, what are you working on and so on, I think people find it really interesting to see how everyone has come to Python and got started in this whole community. So maybe you could just tell me a bit about how you got started in Python and what's your story?
I started doing Python when I was in undergrad. I went to George Mason University, and they had a Python class. And I had already been doing a lot of programming languages throughout my life. Since I was a young kid, I was learning like BASIC and C and played with Pascal and stuff like that. And Python really attracted me as a language. And so I dropped out of school shortly thereafter and just kind of started doing it full time. And here I am.
That's awesome. So you're really glad you just took Python and ran with it, huh? It's working out well?
Yeah, absolutely. I was doing PHP for a while, and I did a little bit of Java and all kinds of stuff. But Python is really resonated deeply with me and what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's cool. So the reason that I reached out to you, the sort of thing that I know you for, if you will, is your requests packages, which is sort of a HTTP client library for Python. Maybe start. I suspect a lot of people know about requests, but not everybody. So maybe you could give me like the 30-second elevator pitch. Like, what's wrong with URLlib? Why did you create this requests package and go with that?
Yeah, so requests is called HTTP for humans. And originally when I created it, it was not called that. It was actually called HTTP for Python that doesn't suck. It was a much more negative title. And it kind of evolved as I was going along, and I decided I didn't want to be putting down other projects, but I wanted to be building up the community. So I called it HTTP for humans. And effectively, the pitch is that if you're, the internet is basically the way we communicate. It's like everything that we do usually goes over the internet when we're building tools today. The entire world revolves around the internet. And so making calls to the internet with Python should be as simple as the print statement. And if you use the built-in tools that come with Python, it's tremendously difficult. So I built requests to make it really great. And I believe I succeeded.
Yeah, I think you did a really fine job. And, whenever I've needed some sort of HTTP client for Python, I definitely use requests. I mean, If I think what I have to write in order to do an authenticated request with URL lib, it's ridiculous.
The default password or password manager with a default realm.
Yes, exactly. So I have to specify the domain or whatever that it is.
Take an opener and then install the opener, and then it's a nightmare.
It's a total nightmare. So yeah, it's definitely a breath of fresh air.
Thank you.
So, building libraries like that, you probably spend a lot of time thinking about APIs and what makes a good API.
Yeah, request is kind of like if people ask me what my favorite libraries are, I usually answer request is my favorite one. Because it is, I've put a lot of thought and design into the way it works, and it is kind of like my personal, totem of good design. But there's a lot of, I'm very opinionated about certain things in Python. PyCon, Raymond Hediger just did a great talk at PyCon called Beyond PEP8, and he kind of got into a lot of these things, it's all basically about like taking the basic data model in Python, and you can make an object behave in any number of ways and using properties and stuff. And I think it's a really good starting place for someone that wants to know how to build good Python code.
Yeah. Okay. That's really cool. And, all those shows are recorded, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I recommend people go check that one out. And just for the listeners who maybe are catching this later or got the recording after a few weeks later, this is April 21st, and PyCon was like a week ago.
Yeah, I just got back 2 or 3 days ago from PyCon.
Yeah, it was last week, wasn't it? That's right.
Yeah, well, I stayed extra long for the sprints, so it was good. I was there for like 12 days in total. It was ridiculous.
Amazing. So before we get to that, can you kind of say a few comments about what you think makes good API design? I mean, obviously Request has it, but what do you think like the essential ingredients are?
Well, so I have a litmus test that I pitch people, and it's basically that if you have to look at the documentation every time you use the module, then you should either find a new module or build a new module.
That's a good plan.
Yeah,
good recommendation.
It's surprisingly difficult when you're using code. Like if you have to, I'm not saying if you pick it up for the first time in months, then you're looking at the docs, but there's certain code bases where you just have the docs and you're looking at them more than you're looking at the code. And to me, that's not, that's a testament to a unergonomic design.
Yeah.
Or a really hard problem space, one of the two.
Right. It could be a super hard problem space, but
even in those cases, there's, you can build a layered API and, you can have a nice human layer as well as a low-level one.
Absolutely. Just because your library might do 100 things, there's probably, 2 or 3 very common use cases. Maybe there should be some higher level abstraction that you use for that.
Precisely.
And then you dig down. I'm thinking of things like we just spoke to Mike Bayer from SQL Alchemy.
Very nice.
With SQL. Yeah, which is a great conversation. And with SQL Alchemy, you've got literally two layers you can think of, right? There's the SQL Alchemy core, which is purely about data access. Then there's the ORM, which is kind of hey, let's keep it a little bit easier, but you have maybe less control over the performance or so on.
It's funny you mention that because I actually want to work on a new project that's like SQL Alchemy for humans. But we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, excellent. So before we move off of requests, let me ask you just a couple of more questions on it. Are there really notable users or sort of famous use cases that you can talk about?
Yeah, well, it's quite ubiquitous. Basically, if anyone's doing Python and HTTP, they are using requests. The one that I'm the most proud of is Amazon uses it for their internal API tools. So everything that runs EC2 and S3 and all of AWS, every single API call goes through requests, which is astonishing because that means it's powering the entire internet.
Yeah, and in some way you are a layer beneath so much of the internet. That's really cool.
Yeah, I'm really proud of that.
Speaking of APIs, one of the things that really puts external pressure on APIs is the whole async programming model. So traditionally with things like Twisted, but more modern with async IO, Does requests have any support for that, or what do you think about APIs in general adapting to these async stories? So
the old way, the current best practice way of doing it is using gevent, and what that does is it monkey patches the entire standard library, and it adds basically callbacks throughout every piece of blocking code in the standard library. in theory. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. It doesn't do a perfect job, but it gets the job done most of the time. And then what you do is you have an event loop, and you say, like, instead of like, you have a function that's like, go get this HTTP request with requests, and that blocks, it's like a very like blocky process. But if you do it with gEvent, you can just say like, run 100 of these, and it does them all concurrently, and it comes back, and it works really well. Then in Python 3, I think in 3.2 they added it. They added this new library called Async.io, and it's Guido's, it used to be known as Tulip. And it is the new asynchronous way of interacting with doing asynchronous work, especially over the network. And it's still very new. It's what is considered to be a provisional package within a standard library, which means that it is not officially done. So there's like a small core that's still being iterated on, and then there's going to be like an official HTTP client after that. And I don't necessarily think that will replace the usage of requests or these blocking style services, but it's too early to tell, I would say. But right now you can use gEvent, and like you get the best of both worlds, and it works really well. Yeah,
that's really cool. I don't think every API or every use case needs to use Async.io. I mean, it's one of these special case scenarios. I'm running a web server and I want to support 20,000 requests on this machine, right? Maybe you need to think about async programming. But if you're just writing like a basic web scraper, then maybe you do, maybe you don't. It depends what you're up to.
Yeah, I mean, you can always scale as long as your performance is predictable. And unfortunately, when you're using something like gEvent, it makes things a lot less predictable. But it depends on what you're doing, really. It's one of those things where you just have to try it and see if it works for your project. A lot of times your code isn't compatible because of different C dependencies, because that always blocks. And it's kind of like this big hairball you're getting yourself into. But if you have the right type of code and you use gEvent, you can come close to like node performance benchmarks and Go. It's really fantastic.
Yeah, that's really great. Michael here. Thank you so much for listening to and spreading the word about Talk Python to me. I'm still looking to line up stable corporate sponsorships, but I wanted to tell you about a community-based campaign I'm launching to allow listeners to directly support the show. We are running a Patreon campaign. Consider supporting us today at patreon.com/mkennedy, and thanks for listening. Okay, so like we were saying before, you just came back from PyCon, and it's amazing. You spent 12 days there. You've been like completely immersed. What are your thoughts?
On the conference itself?
Yeah, just the whole experience, and what was the vibe of Python this year, and so on.
Well, so PyCon is kind of like my way of measuring the year every year. Every year, like most people like think of the new year as the start of their new year, but for me, like PyCon is kind of like where I sit down and think about my life and all this stuff. And it's great because like I go to all these tech conferences all the time for work, and speak at these conferences and events, and I hang out with all these people everywhere, and I get to see almost all of them at PyCon. So for me, it's a very social event. It's very work oriented, but it's also very personal, and it's just kind of like this most intense week of my life. And I had a really great PyCon. I'd say this is my best PyCon so far. The energy of the whole thing was really good. There were some things that were a little different this year, even from last year, which was also in Montreal. I don't know. I liked it, though. It was good. To me, I personally spent a lot more time interacting one-on-one with people instead of like doing these big group talks like kind of normally happens, where you get like 20 people in a circle and everyone's talking. I used to do that constantly. And then this year, I spent a lot more time spending time with the people I wanted to see, and that seemed to be really beneficial to me.
Yeah, that's really excellent. Some of my favorite conferences, I've hardly gone to any of the talks. It's just, you kind of go there and you spend your time with the people and in the environment, and, maybe see the talks, maybe you don't.
Exactly. At PyCon, that's known as the hallway track.
Yeah, awesome. How many years have you been going?
Excuse me. Let's see. This was my first one was 2011, so I guess this is my fourth PyCon.
Excellent. Yeah, so I couldn't go this year. My wife was also traveling, and we have small kids, and we'd be in trouble if we both left town. So.
Well, there's always next year.
Yeah, and it's coming to my hometown, so it's looking good.
Yeah, that'll be great. Brandon Rhodes is running it this year, so I'm really excited to see what he does to it.
Yeah, that'll be fantastic. So, can you tell me what some of your, speaking of not going to the talks and then asking you the opposite question, Can you tell me what some of your favorite sessions or topics that were covered at PyCon?
Well, I didn't go to any talks.
Awesome. So you really enjoyed the hallway track. That's fantastic.
I have almost a no talk policy because I go to a lot of conferences and they all kind of blur together eventually. And especially at PyCon, they're all already up online. Like you can watch them now, and so I just kind of, I do that. And I'm there to see the people. But I have watched a few already, and I really enjoyed Jacob Kaplan-Moss, who is one of the runners of the Django project and a coworker of mine, did a really great keynote that I enjoyed. About just kind of like the diversity in tech problem in that space. He went up on stage and was like, everybody, I'm a mediocre programmer. And I was like, that's pretty cool. And I was thinking if I was to do that talk, I think I would do the opposite. I'm like, I'm an amazing programmer and so are all of you. But it was a good talk. And so that's the only one I think I've really sat down and watched. Although I watched Raymond's talk as well on Beyond Pep 8, and that was, I think, fantastic because I've never seen it so well solidified before how to write good Pythonic code. So I'd recommend checking that out as well.
Okay, yeah, those both sound really awesome. So because I couldn't go, I kind of, YouTube was my connection to PyCon this year. So I'm like, all right, well, let me go through and sort of make a playlist for myself and what I think, at least just reading the descriptions seems like, kind of essential or the real valuable stuff. Now, not to disparage anybody else's stuff that's not on the list or whatever, but these are just the ones that jumped out at me, right?
Yeah.
So on YouTube, I made a playlist. You can find it at bit.ly/PyCon 2015 MK, all lowercase. And I think how many videos I have there? I've got 29 videos apparently.
Nice.
Yeah, and so, some of them that I thought were pretty cool there's one called Bytes Inside the Machine, Inside the C Python Interpreter. And that's by Alison Kaptur. And I thought that was really cool because a lot of time, you spend time so high in sort of the Python code, like looking down at actually what happens when you run it. I thought that was pretty cool. Andrew Baker did one on demystifying Docker.
Oh, yeah.
And I think Docker is going to be massive. It's already kind of massive, but I think it's just at the beginning, I
agree.
Yeah. And so I think understanding Docker is going to be really important if you're doing anything involving like a server, which it's pretty much everyone. Not everyone. There's plenty of people that just run, scripts on their machines, but for the most part, I think people need to understand that. So that's pretty cool. And then Gary Ward did one on how to write reusable code, which sounds a little bit like Beyond Pep 8.
Yeah.
And let's see, a few more. Ryan Kelly did one on PyPy.js.
Oh, I didn't hear about that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, doesn't that sound cool? Like, running Python.
Is this a JavaScript? Is this a JavaScript interpreter?
I don't remember exact. I think it.
I suspect it is because PyPy is, in addition to being a Python interpreter, it's also a platform for building other interpreted languages.
Right, it may well be. So maybe it's running. Yeah, I actually should stop talking because I now know. I've now told you as much as I know about it. other than watching it, because that one I haven't seen. I'd like to get your thoughts on one that Guido did. Just the topic, not because I know neither of us has seen it yet. Is type hints.
Oh yes, Guido. I've talked to Guido about type hints.
What do you think about type hints?
I don't care about them, but I know he's really excited about them, and it's interesting. So it seems like those are being built to serve this particular market that I am very disconnected from, and I think that the people that are involved in the core development of Python are connected to, and it seems to be like these people that are like building compilers and like they're like taking Python code and turning it into something else for like optimization and stuff, and I think that that's the idea behind type hints. I think that's like a use case.
It's definitely a use case. Another one that jumps to mind is if you're building editors like the PyCharm guys.
Yeah, and that seems just really odd to me to build, to build language features around that. But I'm not in that space, so I don't know what the real motivation is. But it just seems a little odd to me. And everyone I talk to also doesn't care about type hints. But it's also one of those things that I don't think you'll need to care about if you're not going to use them, probably.
Yeah, I suspect that's right. If you're coming from Java or C# or some other typeful language, that might convince you to make the leap.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've been doing Python for 10 years, you're like, we don't need this,
Yeah, I'm definitely in a different camp than Guido is. I love Python 2.7, and I feel like I could use it for the rest of my life. I'm planning on fully embracing 3 when everyone else does. And so there's a lot of, like all this new development on these type hints and stuff doesn't sound as exciting to me as like making sure that we have a way to like ship like standalone binaries. I feel like that would be a really great use of our time. I'm not saying that Guido shouldn't be working on this. Like he should work on whatever he wants to work on. And I'm really excited that he's putting the work into this. But I hope other people, don't stop working on other things because of it. And I don't think they will. That's not happening. I was at the Language Summit this year, and we had a really great conversation about the next year in Python. And there was a lot of talk. Guido did one on type hints. There's a lot of really great stuff that kind of came up.
Okay, that's cool. Can you talk about what else was at the Language Summit?
Let me think. I was only there for the second half. I did a talk on requests, and because everyone is really interested in adding it to the standard library. So I did a talk about the pros and cons of that, and basically stated that requests is a critical piece of infrastructure for the Python community because pip relies on it, and like pip ships with Python, and it's like the most popular Python package there is. So I have security updates. When there's like a CVE that's released for HTTP in OpenSSL and stuff, we have to make changes, and Python has a 16-month release cycle, and we've released a version, my maintainers, in like 12 hours. So there's a big difference there. So if request was to go into standard library, it would be I think irresponsible. So we decided together as a group that request is going to be officially recommended in the Python documentation instead of going into the standard library, which seems like a good compromise.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And HTTP being such a critical but vulnerable layer
and morphic layer as well.
What, sorry?
A morphic layer as well. It changes over time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely changing, and if that needs to be fixed, it needs to be fixed now, not in a year. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that was a good takeaway.
It seems like a good takeaway. Cool. Well, I guess one more that I thought was worth calling out, and maybe we'll do a show on this one, is a guy named David Beasley.
Yes.
Did one on modules and packages.
Oh, very nice.
I did a 3-hour workshop on it. And you think, what is there to know about modules and packages for 3 hours? But actually, there's a lot of really interesting stuff about like creating maintainable sub-imports when you're building large packages and all sorts of cool stuff that I think is actually a lot of people would get a lot out of. So that's also on that list of videos.
Yeah, David Beasley always does amazing work. He's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it was really, really good. So that was fantastic. So what else would you like to get out into the community about Python and just let people know while you got a chance?
Let me think. I've been very concerned for a long time about the adoption of Python 3, and I still am. And we had some discussion about that at PyCon as well. And it's interesting. It seems as though on certain platforms, like where I work at Heroku, we have about a 10% in the last month or so deploy rate for Python 3, which is really surprising. And it seems to me as though this, and it's also, if you look at the cheese shop numbers, Python 3 is starting to get a little bit more usage. It's still extremely minimal and far behind what we want, but the needle is moving. And it's really fascinating because the only thing that I can tell has changed is that Django, when they made their last release, they just used Python 3 by default. And that seems to have a tremendous impact on people, on users of the language in general. Just having literally the quick start for Django, and all the documentation is just Python 3 by default. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that there's a lot to learn about that and just kind of think about that and just be like, maybe if I share code samples with people, they should be Python 3, not Python 2. Maybe that'll help make a big difference. If we just like shift our default mode, maybe it'll get us over this hump. Because I am concerned about the future of the language. I think that we have a big marketing problem. I think that there's this product that's being built that no one wants, and so no one's using it. And I think that it's just all about getting on the same page.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I mean, even if it's just going to blog something and put up a code snippet, if you started making that Python 3 more frequently, that would probably send some kind of signal to the world, Yeah, it's just so interesting to see. I mean, like the needle is like actually moving, and it is because Django changed their docs to use Python 3, and that blows my mind. It can't be that easy. Well, nobody would have, thought that would make the difference, but, sometimes things are unpredictable, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm all in favor of us I've been for a long time. If you talk to me in private, I'd always say that I'm a Python 2 user for life. And I do kind of feel that way, but the reality is that the Python community is valuable enough to me that I don't care what I'm using as long as we're all using the same thing. So I think that we should all just kind of embrace the change and just see what happens.
I think when you look at the actual code, sort of like modern Python 2 versus Python 3, there's not that much of a difference. It's kind of the libraries or the packages that you want to take along. You're like, oh, this doesn't support Python 3. Well, this project isn't using Python 3.
Yeah, it definitely depends on the style of project you're doing too. So if you're doing something that deals with bytes as text, which I do a lot because I work with HTTP, then Python 3 is the worst language in human history, basically.
Yeah, it's true, because the string stuff is really pretty different, right?
Yeah, so if you have a byte string and you can't do anything with it anymore, it's just like it's like a byte array of bytes, of integers. And so if you can't do like formatting and stuff, I think they added formatting back, actually, I think in 3.4. But they didn't add the dot format method. They did the percentage, the modulus override, which is ridiculous. But so you can format strings again, but still you can't parse them very easily. You can't work with them very easily as text. And to me, Python 3 makes a lot of sense in a world where everything is Unicode, but we don't live in that world. Because like when you're sending stuff over the internet, when you're writing it to disk, when you're sending an email, it's all actually bytes. And so I really enjoyed the flexibility that Python 2 had in that. And that was like my favorite part of the language, and they kind of took that away from me. So I am de-incentivized to use 3 personally. And if you look at like Armin Ronacher, the guy who wrote Flask, he writes really detailed blog posts about the same problem. And it sucks, but at the same time, like if you usually when you're interacting with that stuff, you're dealing with libraries. We deal with it because we're library authors. So if we solve the problem, then it's okay for everybody else.
Right. You guys are basically the firewall to that problem, right? You live literally at the network layer, both of you. And by the way, we're going to have him on and do a show on Flask.
Oh, fantastic.
And other topics as well pretty soon. So
I'm looking forward to listening to that.
Yeah, but I think, you probably feel it worse than a lot of people because you live at the network boundary.
Yeah, to me, adding Python 3 to requests was like one of the most painful things I've ever done as a programmer. Definitely one of the most frustrating, if not the most frustrating. But I learned a lot from it too. It got better in some ways. Like in Python 2, it was admittedly unclear if you were dealing with bytes or Unicode. So before in requests, if you got back an HTTP response, and if I could decode it to Unicode, it would just be Unicode. The content of it would be like response.content. And if it was Unicode, it'd be Unicode. If it was bytes, it'd be bytes, and it would like change. And then when I went to 3, that API doesn't work anymore. It's just not possible. So you had to split them up. So now there's .content, which is always bytes, and there's .text, which is always Unicode. And that is a superior API design and something I should have done before. And using Python 3 helped me design it better. So I do think it's a good... I think that there's a lot of benefits to using 3. I think that, there'll be a lot less data loss errors that people have, but at the same time, it's like really fucking frustrating.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So how do you think Python 3 would look different if it was 90% use case? Like, do you think there would be different pressure applied to it, or would it just be slightly more polished?
Do you mean if So, like with requests, I say that...
Well, imagine like we could snap our fingers and tomorrow, like 90% of Python projects that are active today are using Python 3.
Gotcha. What would that change? What would the world look like?
Do you think Python 3 would be changed by that, or do you think people would just adapt? Like, are there things in Python 3 that just haven't had enough, we need it this way, pressure put upon it?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I feel like it is possible for us to have a 90% adoption rate now. It just takes a lot of time. And really the problem is that Python 3 right now isn't attractive enough to incentivize people to rewrite all their code to work with 3. If you have existing code, you have to change it in order to get it to work. And so Python 3, I do think to get to that point, we either need a lot of time or we need to incentivize users by making something really attractive that looks really nice. And there's been some talks of like, what if we remove the GIL? Would that be attractive enough? And stuff like that. there's a lot of different options, and none of them are very clear at this point. But
Right, that's a really interesting idea. And I do think you need like the killer reason.
Yeah.
It forced a lot of people to go to the trouble of actually changing code. Like it's one thing to say we'll do new projects in Python 3, but how many new projects do people do versus like we've had this whole infrastructure for 10 years and now
it's so funny. I went to go do that recently and it was just so frustrating. And I think I was using Flask. I don't think it has they support 3, but I don't know if it's like proper 3 support. There was something I was running into, and it was just like I wanted to throw my computer out the window. And it's like everything works great with 2. Why should I have to deal with this? So I don't, and that's what everybody does because they don't. So It'll be interesting to see what happens. I have faith that the community will, whatever happens is what is intended to happen. It'll be for the best.
All right.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's just a little unhealthy that there's such like the forward progress is kind of being put on the language on 3, but a lot of the real work is still being done in 2, and it just seems like that can't be a real positive thing.
Yeah, and to me the biggest problem is that we stand up and preach the PEP 20, the Zen of Python all the time. And one of the best ones in there is there should be one obvious way to do it. And you go to python.org and you want to go download Python, and you have to pick Python 2 or Python 3. It is like, right. What? No. It's just it's confusing for new users. And so you have a lot of new users that are using 3, and they're actually really adamant about 3. So if you go onto like Reddit or Hacker News and you see anything about Python 2, you'll have all these people that are like bashing them, being like, why aren't you using 3, man? It's so old. And it's like, who are these people? Because I go to conferences and I meet all the Python developers that go to conferences, and those people aren't at the conferences. And it took me a while to figure it out. It's the new people. Because when you're new and you're learning to code and it's like your hobby, you're like online all day, like typing on Hacker News and on Reddit, So there's like...
You're not busy, you can go complain.
Yeah, exactly. So, the people who work for companies, they're using 2, but, the new kids are starting to use 3, and I would like for that to be the same community, not 2 different communities, and it appears as though at this time there are 2 different communities. So I just want us to be unified instead of separated.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, if you're starting a new project, you have the flexibility and whatever, but if you're working on older technology that was written before Python 3 even came out, there's maybe no choice at all, right? That's what you're going to be using. So yeah, a lot of the companies I visit, they're still Python 2 as well, of course.
Yeah, I don't know any major companies that are using 3 at all, but I'm sure there are some.
Yeah, there's a few I've talked to, but I don't want to say because I might get it wrong and conflate them with other companies I spoke to. So, but yeah, there's a few, but you're right, but it's not a large portion.
Yeah. But I'm hopeful that everything will unfold as it's supposed to.
Did you guys talk about that at the Language Summit?
It was not brought up as much as you'd think. It was more... So there was one great talk. It was by Jacob, again. And he went up on stage and he was kind of just showing some numbers that he has access to on different adoption rates. And it was interesting. So basically what he said was that if we want to treat this like a soft... Oh, no, it was Glyph. Glyph did a talk. Sorry. Jacob did a great talk on this same subject, but Glyph did a fantastic talk, the author of Twisted. And he got up there and he was saying, look at this problem space that we have. We all agree that it's a problem, right? And everyone agrees. And he moves forward and he's like, okay, so the problem is that we don't have anything to measure to see if we're improving on this problem. So the first thing we need to do is decide what does, when this problem is solved, what does that look like, right? So to do that, you have to decide to measure something. So, ideally it'd be like 20%, so an example metric would be like 50% of Python downloads, of package downloads from the C# or Python 3, or like a majority of the downloads from python.org for Python versions would be Python 3. Like, let's pick something and try to optimize it, basically. And that was very much like what he was going for. He was like, let's not leave this room until we decide on a metric together, or at least decide that we need a metric, right? And so it seemed as though everyone agreed that we needed a metric. We didn't even come close to deciding what it was. But it was a good discussion, and I feel like that there's a lot of merit to that type of thinking. Yeah, treating this like a software project instead of like a hobby project, basically.
Right, well, yeah, let's make this a data-driven problem that we can apply graphs and science and statistics too, or whatever, right?
Exactly.
That'd be awesome.
Exactly. So I think that's going to happen this year. They got everyone thinking. So
Yeah, that's cool. Like one thought comes to mind is like track the number of requests from pip 2 versus pip 3.
precisely.
Just just not necessarily even the downloads, just the number of like how much are people using this version versus that version, right? Those kinds of things. You should totally be able to track that.
Yeah, and so there's some really great blog posts that have come out about this. Donald Stuff just did one today. His domain is caremad.io, I believe. And he just did his big blog post breaking down all the PyPy numbers. So I highly recommend checking that out. Because it shows you, it's weird, web people are adopting Python 3 faster than the rest of the Python community by about 4%, which is pretty interesting.
That is really interesting. I think that is something I would have not predicted, but would say, yeah, that seems like you're telling me something true. Just hearing out of the blue is, because you have so much more control over the server, right? You manage a thing. If on the other hand, if you're shipping it out to the world, you don't know where it's going to land, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There's a scientific Python community, and I think that they're having smaller amounts of 3 adoption, but I have to learn more.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Like the IPython guys and so on.
Yeah, and Continuum, and like they support 3 with like Anaconda, but I think that is like a new thing that people are still adjusting to, because the scientists, if you're a data scientist, you're probably not a programmer. And you're someone who can use these tools, and so you don't care if it's 2 or 3. You just want to get your job done, basically. So I think 3 has a lot of political buy-in, basically.
Cool. So you said you work at Heroku, right?
I do. I'm the Python overlord at Heroku.
It's good to be an overlord, I guess.
I enjoy it.
So what are you doing there? What do you guys do with Python at Heroku?
So I am basically, Heroku supports a number of languages. We have like Ruby, Java, Node, PHP support, Python. And I am just in charge of everything related to Python. So I write a lot of documentation. I help customers, and I just improve the product. And if you do like git push Heroku, and like you have a Python app, then all the code that runs that is me. And I go to speak to conferences, and I'm on a podcast. This is technically work, I guess. It's a good gig.
Yeah, this is work.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's really cool to be kind of out there as the community front for a cool company like Heroku.
Yeah, I enjoy it. Do
you guys use it a lot internally? Like, can you talk about what technology you have for yourselves?
Yeah, so there's a couple different teams internally that use a lot of Python. There's specific spots in Heroku that are just kind of infrastructure that are written in Python. So if all of our Postgres servers get continuously backed up, the wall logs get continuously backed up to S3, and that's written with a tool called Wally, which we have open sourced. And if you go onto our GitHub, you'll see it's written in Python. And a couple different things. If you do a git push to us, I believe over SSH, I believe all of those are received by a twisted conch shell, which is pretty cool in Python. And but there's a couple different teams internally that also use a lot of Python. There's the Heroku Connect team, which lets you interact with your Salesforce's data over Postgres. Gives you a Postgres database to read and write all your Salesforce data to. And that's like a Django app. And there's a couple other teams that, there are a lot of tools that are built with Python.
Cool. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
So before we go, let me ask you a question that I ask, all my guests. In addition to requests, what is your favorite package on PyPy?
Ooh. I have to pick one?
Well, give me a couple that you really like. Just I mostly want to just draw people's attention to stuff that's cool.
Okay, so one of my favorites is called docopt, DOCOPT. And what that is, if you want to do a command line tool, you have to parse command line arguments. And to do that, it's not very fun. There's argparse and optparse that are built into the standard library, and they're both terrible. I wrote something that makes it a little easier, but this guy killed it. So what he did was, so it turns out that the help string that's printed out when you do like command-h, right, on the command line, you know how you see those like little brackets and stuff that like tells you all the different options? That is an ANSI standard, it turns out. And so what he does is you write the help script, like you write the help page, and you like say all the different options, and you write the little arguments and which ones are optional and which ones are positional and all this stuff. And from that, he completely writes all the parsing code for you. So you just give it the string and you just say, give me my arguments. And it gives you a dictionary with all the stuff and the booleans and the true falses, and it's incredible. I love it.
That is really fantastic.
Yeah, and it's been ported to like every language. So, but I think Python's the default one. So it's I'm a big fan of that project.
Right, that's cool. I always feel like I'm reinventing the wheel when I go over there. It's like, okay, start from scratch. So that's great to bring that in.
Yeah. Let's see. Another one that I am excited about but haven't used yet is called Click by Armin Ronacher, and I'm sure you'll talk to him about that when you do your podcast with him. But a couple years ago, I wrote a library for myself called Clint, and Clint was a command line application tools set of utilities, basically. I had a bunch of cool stuff in there, like prompting for yes and no, parsing arguments, writing files to the home directory on every type of computer, I had my favorite module that I had in there was called eng.join. So you would give it a list of strings, and then it would join them properly with like an Oxford comma and conjunctions, so.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's like really cool code. But it kind of, I need to separate all that stuff out because it's kind of a dead project. I haven't used it in years. And Click is Armin's approach to the same problem. It doesn't do all the same stuff, but it's like, Armin does amazing code. And so this is a project that just is like, if you're going to write command line applications, you need to use Click. So I'm really excited about that.
Cool. Oh, excellent. Those are really nice. If I wanted to get started with Heroku as a Python, let's say I'm writing a Django app or Flask or something, what do I do?
Well, you go to Heroku.com and you sign up for an account, and it should tell you what to do.
Awesome. Okay, so everyone check that out.
Yeah, and if you have any questions about Heroku and Python, feel free to reach out to me or tweet at me or whatever.
Yeah, very cool. Any final shout-outs you want to give?
Off the top of my head, let me think. I'm going to shout out to you for making this awesome podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. The world needs more Python podcasts.
I agree.
You're doing good work.
Yeah, my original goal was not to start a Python podcast, but just to talk to some of them. And I found that they all had their last show like a year ago. I'm like, wait a minute, that can't be right.
Nice.
Looked. No,
yeah,
it's sadly right.
Mine included. I have a 1-episode podcast, but it was great. It had 6,000 listens.
That's awesome. Where do people find it?
It's called Import This. It's Alex
This.
Gaynor and I. And we have 2 other episodes recorded. It's just a matter of editing time. I would like to get a sponsor. So if we got a sponsor, it would be easier to edit.
It would boost you back into it.
Yeah, it's just like it took me 8 hours to edit the first episode because I was doing like Radiolab quality. So if I either need to just settle for lower quality or ideally I'd be able to pay a company to edit it for me. But I don't know. We'll see.
Exactly. That would be nice. I think editing is actually the most work.
It is. Yeah, it's ridiculous. So we'll get back to it eventually.
Definitely. Well, you should. All right, Kenneth, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been really interesting, and I especially appreciate like the insight into the Language Summit and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. And I will talk to you later.
Have a good one.
This has been another episode of Talk Python to Me. Today's guest was Kenneth Reitz. Thanks, Kenneth. Remember, you can find the links from the show at talkpython2me.com/episodes/show/6. And if you're feeling generous, please check out our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/mkennedy or work with your company to encourage them to sponsor an episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show. Visit the website and choose subscribe in iTunes or grab the episode RSS feed and drop it into your favorite podcatcher. You can find both these in the footer of every page. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Thanks for listening.
Stating with my voice, there's no norm that I can feel within. Haven't been sleeping, I've been using lots of rest. I'll pass the mic back to who rocked it best.